Welcome to This Jungian Life. Three good friends and Jungian analysts, Lisa Marciano, Deborah Stewart, and Joseph Lee, invite you to join them for an intimate and honest conversation that brings a psychological perspective to important issues of the day.
I'm Lisa Marciano, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Philadelphia.
I'm Joseph Lee, and I'm a Jungian analyst in Virginia Beach, Virginia.
I'm Deborah Stewart, a Jungian analyst on Cape Cod. Today, we're going to talk about Jung's concept of reductive and prospective methods, which relates to energy. And in case this sounds just sort of a little too abstract and kind of out there, what this has to do with is how and when and whether and to what extent things are causal, maybe prompted by the external world, the past, your experiences back when, versus prospective, where it's going, where is its final energic destination, as it were. So forward and back, reductive, prospective, mechanistic, energic, or finalistic. This reminds me of the Roman god Janus, who was two-faced. One face looked toward the past, and the other looked ahead.
That's a great introduction, Deb, and I think you're right. It might sound kind of arcane somehow, but this really matters in psychotherapy. It's kind of a bedrock question, because how do we understand people's suffering? Do we see it as all related to the person's past, or is there another way to look at it that frees us up and gives us more options? You know, Jung did spend a lot of time thinking about this, and he came up with some really interesting observations. And to a certain extent, his work on this question was in answer to Freud, who did tend to favor the reductive method of looking back to the past to understand someone's struggles in the present. And of course, to this day, that's a very foundational part of most psychodynamic psychotherapies, such that it's kind of a meme, right? You go into therapy and the therapist says, "Tell me about your childhood."
And your mother.
And your mother. If it's not one thing, it's your mother. And there's a good reason for this, but Jung wanted to kind of expand on that as well.
And so for Freud, one of the reasons that we went back into the history is that there were unresolved developmental moments in the past or traumas that locked people into a certain kind of developmental dynamic. And by going back in time, analyzing or speculating where those things are caught up and providing some kind of a new way of thinking about it, some people really did experience some relief, or in Freudian terms, an abreaction. They went back to a moment, they had a big emotional release, and something kind of softened for them. Mm-hmm. All of us have seen that in our work, and it's not uncommon in the beginning of a process where we do past history work, if for no other reason to understand the personal mythology, but also to clean up some of that early life tension so that we can then turn our interests to the emergent dimension with the client. So in terms of the reductive, Freud had this idea that the sexual life force evolved and particularly moved to different places of the body as a child developed. And if they resolved the challenges of those different life force zones of the body, people would then structure a personality left, ideally in a reasonably functional way at the end of it. And so people are really familiar with things like the oral complex, or having an oral personality versus being anal retentive. Those are two things that are very commonly known in the culture. And surprisingly, not too long ago, I would say maybe just 20 or 30 years ago, an intake form in many institutions, including psychiatric hospitals, included questions about your toilet training. because that Freudian model of looking back to early childhood was so integrated into most mental health care analyses.
I think that the causal or etiological or early determinative views that our culture has readily absorbed has a problem. And that is that it kind of constructs a closed system.
Mm-hmm.
You know that what happened to you during your oral phase of development or your anal phase of development or your phallic phase of development somehow is locked in and determinative. And Jung was interested in where is it going and how does new energy come in? And what is that about? That something can change, that something moves forward, something develops a new direction.
And of course, one of the big differences between Jung and Freud is that Freud felt that the unconscious was a repository for things that were repressed or forgotten or perhaps never reached the threshold of consciousness at all. And Jung agreed that the unconscious was made up of all of those things, but also said that the unconscious could give rise to creative new possibilities. The unconscious is creative. And that matters in terms of the topic that we're discussing here today, because it can be that the unconscious finds its way down a gradient toward some kind of new equilibrium, and that the psyche, the personality, is drawn forward toward some kind of eventual goal or telos that you don't understand consciously, but the energy in the unconscious moves the psyche forward. I want to go back for a second to what we were talking about the reductive method. And Joseph, you gave such a great description of these Freudian stages and the way a Freudian might see it. I think for many mental health practitioners, the Freudian conception has been replaced by, I want to say, kind of a trauma-centered conception. So that nowadays, if you go into therapy, you may find that the therapist is very interested in early traumas. And there's been a little bit of concept creep around this term. As it first appeared in the DSM, trauma really referred to an incident in which there was a threatened loss of life or bodily integrity, or that you witnessed such a thing happening to another person. So, a severe accident or a rape or a wartime trauma, which is where the concept of PTSD really first took hold, was with Vietnam vets. But there's been a little bit of concept creep, and now it tends to refer to any very difficult experience. We're likely to look, and I think we all do this to a certain extent, and with a certain degree of justification, any symptom that someone is facing, we make an assumption that it must have been preceded by a trauma, and we go off looking for that trauma. And so the early stages of any psychodynamic psychotherapy is likely to involve looking for past traumas. And I think that this can be helpful in a number of ways. I mean, I think for one thing, it can be helpful to excavate the past and do a little bit of discerning what was maybe helpful to me and what was less helpful. It reminds me of those tasks given to heroines in fairy tales where they have to sort the seeds. So to a certain extent, if you've never really talked or thought about your childhood before, sitting and doing that with a therapist, well, my mother used to, drink half a bottle of wine every night, and then her personality would change. And I never thought before that, that was kind of alcoholic behavior, but now I see that maybe it was. And that gives me a new way to understand certain things that happened. This can be really valuable in kind of bringing a high resolution look at some childhood stuff, and maybe bringing some more consciousness to things that you've never really given much thought to before. And I do think that it can be very true that there are sort of capital T traumas in our childhood that we haven't maybe realized. I'm thinking of one person I worked with who really had a physically and emotionally abusive mother. And that work had never really been done. And there were ways in which this was really affecting her. And we had to go back and kind of dig up those bones and do a lot of grieving around it, and also reimagining kind of who she was. I mean, you go through the world thinking that you're one person, that you are, the daughter of so and so, and you have this or that profession or whatever. To add to your sense of self, and I had an abusive parent, it remakes you in ways that can be quite empowering.
So I'm thinking that from the point of view of our reductive aspect, Jung's reductive aspect of energy, that by going to the past and really processing and digging up the bones, as you said, takes the energy and lets it sort of flow downhill. It lets it release. It lets it decrease so that all that stored up, unprocessed feeling and experience of the past has somewhere to go, sort of like releasing water that has been dammed up. And it can go from a higher state of intensity to a lower state of intensity and kind of come to a place of stillness or rest. That's the point of doing this causal or reductive work.
Yes, it's as if these unresolved childhood traumas are encapsulated and don't have the benefit of the evolving understanding of the adult ego. So it's almost like there's a little computer subroutine in the back of your personality that keeps running this old task, which might sound like, hiding from daddy, which gets kicked off every time we're around a male authority figure. We don't understand it. It's causing problems at work or preps and other environments. And for many of us, being able to follow that track into the wilderness and ideally really reconnect to those early childhood memories of hiding or feeling intimidated by dad can release something and also allow that young image of ourself that seems trapped in time to mature and be added to our adult self, and find in a way that's very real that we are either less or no longer triggered by the same antecedents. This also goes to Jung's work with the word association test, and to some degree his work with the complex. Inasmuch as he would read a list of words, somebody would have a strange reaction to the word tree. They suddenly started laughing, or they couldn't think of an association, or said something goofy in response. And what would happen as he would ask them, well, why do you think that was a difficult thing to respond to? People would generally have slightly troubling memories that were woven around the idea of the tree, which could be any number of things, some perhaps not terribly traumatic, and some could be really serious. But that was a kind of knot, K-N-O-T, in the psyche, and that was causing a certain amount of tension, which prevented people from moving forward. Coming back to what you guys were saying, the reason that we try to release something from the past is so we have fuel that's available for the engine of the psyche to move forward and to get back on track with its own authentic agenda.
It is so important to look at the past, to understand it. As you both just been saying, it can release energy, it can abreact emotion, it can kind of give us new choices about how we respond to things. I think the problem is when that's all that we do. And unfortunately, I think that might happen with some frequency in certain therapies. Jung saw the value in Freud's approach. He did not discredit it or discard it. He just wanted to bring in also a final perspective or a prospective perspective looking forward to the future. And we can talk in a minute more about what that looks like. But for now, Let's just talk for a minute about what can go wrong if we stay in the reductive frame only. And to me, I think that it kind of keeps you finding the answer you already knew. It keeps you in a kind of stuck story. I've had this happen, that people come in with a story about, their way their mother was. And week after week after week after week after week, that's what we talk about. And maybe the person is 60 years old, but every disappointment goes back to the way my mother was.
Mm-hmm.
And there's no progress there.
It's as if we all started out as empty vessels in a state of stasis, where the external world sort of emptied into us as if pouring concrete. And then that concrete hardened, and then that's the way it is.
Right.
It's that way forever. And that is what Jung was so interested in exploring. And so where is energy going? And the assumption is that we don't enter the world as just empty vessels or tabula rasas, that we come into the world in actually a highly energized state. And we are always making something of our experience. This has actually been proved, the highly energized state of infants. They've been tested in hospitals. And there's a whole system of categorization of the quiet baby, the slow to warm up baby, the active or interactive baby. And I will just share some history. I had twins, and I can tell you that before I had had a chance to do any influencing of them, on day one, they were remarkably different temperaments. And I think that lends a very hopeful, real world, scientific, if you will, note to Jung's idea that we come into the world with energy and it wants to go somewhere. We make something of our experiences, and we continue to do that all our lives.
Yeah. And so when you go into therapy and the only thing you talk about is your, quote unquote traumas, it doesn't allow for this wonderful process that you've elucidated, Deb.
Mm-hmm.
Right. We can get lost in the traumatic narrative because when we are aligned with a causal theory or a mechanistic theory, it seems that life is always happening to us.
Yes.
And the most common narrative that, of course, we all experience in ourselves, but here a good bit of time in social media, is that this thing was done to me in the past, and I am irreparably or permanently damaged. And now I want to go back in time and process that thing that happened in the past, which is fine because we do need to release some of the energy. But we can wind up getting so seduced by the shifting of responsibility to the past event that we find ourselves defending against taking hold of the situation and moving forward beyond it.
Mm-hmm.
Right. It's like another way of getting attached to that past event.
It also assumes that experience, life, comes into us from the outside versus what we ourselves bring to our lives from the inside. And actually, that was a fairly Freudian view versus Jung's emphasis on the life within, which, of course, we see in dreams every single night, that there is life within and it is going somewhere. Versus, sorry, these things happen to you and now they're determinative.
Yeah, that's a great point, actually, to look at dreams in terms of this, because you can look at dreams sort of reductively. People can have a tendency to do that. Like, for example, if you have a disturbing dream, someone might come and say, hey, did something happen to me? And like, this is sort of the memory of it. And that certainly can happen. I don't want to say that can never happen. But most of the time, I think dreams are oriented more prospectively. And they may be showing us sort of a root cause, but they're also pointing to where something's going. They're more interested, I think, in where something's going than what it was caused by. And Jung talks about this a lot. And it's something that we spend some time on in dream school, actually, as well. So that's a great example, Deb, I think, because, it's like, why does the dream maker bother to give you a dream? Not just so the dream maker could say, it's because of how you were treated when you were young. It's like, you can't do anything about that. It's sort of, last year's snow. That's an expression, I think, from Serbo-Croatian, but it's a great expression. It's like, what are you going to do? It's sort of gone.
Mm-hmm.
But if it's like, okay, but here's where things are going. Here's where you can influence things. Here's where the arrow is still flying through the air. There's this movement, and dreams are really interested in tracking that.
Dreams are very interested in tracking current experience, which is a great synthesis of outer world experience and inner world experience. So something happens at work or with your partner or whatever. Yes, that's the outer world experience. And then your inner world makes some sense of it. And then the dream maker decides to jump in and provide kind of a picture of where might this be going inside. That if this, then this and this and this and this. I think that's one of the reasons, certainly Jung and we too prioritize dream work, is that it does give a picture of where the energy in a given individual is going, what it is related to in the past in terms of an attitude and feelings. Also, where is it going? What are the possibilities? And that, I think, is so important, is what's ahead. There is still life in each one of us, and it's going somewhere.
I want to go back to this little case that I mentioned obliquely, this woman who had, an abusive, physically abusive mother, and how important it was that we did that kind of trauma work, and we named it, and we looked at it, and we spent a lot of time processing it, and creating room for the feelings and altering the life narrative to include that. And then it was sort of what you said, Joseph. It was like something kind of got cleared away, and then life could really just reach forward. And another thing that happened was it actually really shifted her relationship both with the inner mother, and we saw this in the dreams, that the inner mother started to change. It also allowed her to change her relationship with her outer mother. And she was not so affected anymore by either one. I mean, still, obviously, yes, of course. But it didn't have quite the grip on her that it had had before, which just made room for her to move forward and kind of follow the arc of that arrow through the air in her life. It was a great example of the both and.
When we think about how any of us and our analyses can perseverate around something that happened in the past over and over again, year after year, and allowing other developmental opportunities to fall out of their hands because it's so hypnotic to stare at the past.
Yeah.
So getting that cleaned up a bit, or at least loosened up a bit, can create space for a lot of forward movement. And I use that term loosened up because your historic events are kind of newsreel. I mean, the true things that happen to you are going to stay in the internal library. The question is, how much energy do they have to influence the course or the self-directing course of the ego? Another way of talking about the synthetic or the constructive stance is saying that we're looking at the fantasy material, whether that's daydreams, goals, night dreams, and we're holding this lens that there are traces of future psychological development in the narrative that's emerging. So if we did have a dream, and let's say, actually we'll use a lived experience, which I find interesting. A friend of mine had gone into a Freudian analysis, and we were talking about it. And she had all of these intense longings to move back to her hometown after she had attended a high school reunion. And in her Freudian analysis, she was told that that was a longing to return to the mother, that it was wanting to go into the nostalgic embrace of the past, to be cared for in the way that she had been cared for before, and even return to the fantasy of the family, that all her old friends were going to be a kind of family. And if she just left her current life and career and moved back to the hometown, this idealized maternal dynamic would return. So that's an interesting lens to put on that, and there's some truth to it. For her, that was very meaningful, and it had the effect of dispersing the intense fantasy of wanting to move back to the hometown. She had a different lens of understanding that allowed the energy to disperse, ideally for the libido to go into a different kind of direction. But if we were to take a perspective lens, we might say that her fantasies of returning to the high school reunion and being restored is actually a future psychological development. That there's something in the fantasy of being received, seen, held, valued can move her forward, and particularly if it's not concretized as her needing to physically relocate to the hometown. But there's a symbolic desire to return home. Now, the impulse to return home is enormous and archetypal. Home can mean anything from preparing for the end of life to returning to one's authentic nature in service to individuation. But those two interpretations I offered would be something that's more akin to the emergent process of completing the personal mission, not just kind of going home so I could be a kid again.
You know, it's a great example, Joseph. And one of the things it brings up for me is that the reductive approach tends to devalue, fantasy material, dreams. It tends to, maybe devalue is the wrong word. Maybe the word I'm looking for is kind of pathologize it, that it's an example of wanting to regress. Whereas in this case, the final view or the prospective view sees something in it of real value. And again, I think it's a both and. I think it's a both and that both things can be valuable and add a sort of layered, nuanced understanding of a phenomenon like that.
I agree that that was a great example, Joseph, about how the energetic, finalistic Jungian view adds to something because it was in effect a transformation of energy. It didn't get concretized as a regression to the past, but the intensity of this person's feeling and longing could be examined from where is it going? What is it looking for? Without necessarily fixating it on moving back to her hometown. And then the energy was used for her life in an ongoing present way.
That she had a bigger question she was gestating than whether or not she should move back to Hoboken or something.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. It didn't get boxed up with the lid down as what they would call a fixed gestalt. It was allowed to move somewhere.
Yeah, I mean, as we've said before, I think the final approach or the prospective approach is profoundly optimistic. And it actually assumes that the psyche is self-regulating and can create new attitudes and new approaches. And this idea about the psyche being self-regulating is really important. And I know we've spoken about it before on the podcast, but it's really tied up in this because the sense of the finalistic approach is that, again, the psyche is seeking always equilibrium, as happens in biological processes within the body, so that the energy flows along a gradient toward a new kind of equilibrium, and that the psyche is always engaged in this dynamic process of finding balance.
And that it's in that state of balance or tension between the opposites that the self can push its own agenda into the personality development, which goes into some of this transpersonal ideas that Jung had. And how I would sum it up is that when we are caught too much in this reductive analysis, our history has become God. And when we can shift out of that, we can see that the pressure of the self to incarnate through us becomes a new version of God, which is a very different way of sitting with our relationship to the self and to the life that we've been exposed to.
Oh, Joseph, that was just perfect. And it brings up this quote. I know we've read this quote many times on the podcast, but I can't resist going there again. Jung says, "But no matter how much parents and grandparents may have sinned against the child, the man who is really adult will accept these sins as his own condition, which has to be reckoned with. Only a fool is interested in other people's guilt, since he cannot alter it. The wise man learns only from his own guilt. He will ask himself, 'Who am I that all this should happen to me?' To find the answer to this fateful question, he will look into his own heart." It brings up this sense that when we're dealing with the final view, we're coming from an empowered place of responsibility for ourselves. And if we lean too heavily into the reductive view, we are passive victims unable to make a change.
Mm-hmm. And that goes back to the inherent optimism in this Jungian stance, that within each person there is transformative, creative energy that wants to go someplace. And I know that when people first come into analysis or a psychotherapeutic process, it often just doesn't feel like that is really there. There is a low point here. And yet that is part of the process, inherent in the process, without which the process is incomplete, is for each person to find that determinative, energetic, creative place of internal energy that gives us a sense of meaning and purpose and just enlivenment.
I want to bring up another point that's connected, I think, which is, in our walking around the reductive approach and naming some of the pitfalls with it, I want to just maybe dial in on some nuance around that. Personally, I don't believe that it's true that the past does not affect us. Of course, our past affects us. What I do think is also true is that sometimes our past affects us in mysterious ways. It's not always predictable that having a certain kind of traumatic event will result in a certain kind of adult. We know population-wide that adverse childhood events will have all kinds of impacts. But on the level of an individual, we don't know. Some people face horrible trauma in childhood and become very resilient. When I worked with Vietnam vets, there were those who had seen terrible things and had, horrible symptoms as a result. And there were others who'd seen terrible things who did not have such symptoms. So I think we need to leave room for kind of the mystery that we don't know that a particular, even trauma with a capital T, is going to have a certain effect on us. And again, I think it points to what you were talking about, Deb, that we sort of start life as a highly energized system. And we're not just a sort of empty vessel to be filled up with concrete. I want to illustrate this with a little bit of an excerpt from a fairy tale. It's a Hungarian fairy tale called The Boy Who Could Keep a Secret. And it appears in the Crimson Fairy Tale book by Lang. And it has such an interesting beginning. It's a very long tale. I'm just going to read a little bit from the beginning and then a bit from the very end. Once upon a time, there lived a poor widow who had one little boy. At first sight, you would not have thought that he was different from 1,000 other little boys. But then you noticed that by his side hung the scabbard of a sword. And as the boy grew bigger, the scabbard grew bigger too. The sword which belonged to the scabbard was found by the little boy sticking out of the ground in the garden, and every day he pulled it up to see if it would go into the scabbard. But though it was plainly becoming longer and longer, it was some time before the two would fit. However, there came a day at last when it slipped in quite easily. The child was so delighted that he could hardly believe his eyes, so he tried it 7 times, and each time it slipped in more easily than before. But pleased though the boy was, he determined not to tell anyone about it, particularly not his mother, who could never keep anything from her neighbors. In spite of his resolutions, he could not hide altogether that something had happened, and when he went into breakfast, his mother asked him what was the matter. "Oh, mother, I had such a nice dream last night," he said, "but I can't tell it to anybody." "You can tell it to me," she answered. "It must have been a nice dream or you wouldn't look so happy." "No, mother, I can't tell it to anybody until it comes true." So what happens next is the mother is so upset that she beats him for not telling her. And he doesn't tell, but he sits by the side of the road and he's sobbing. And the king is passing by in his coach and he hears the noise of the sobbing child. And he stops to find out what it is. And the boy explains it to him. The king says, "Well, come with me. Will you be my son?" So this sets off all of these adventures. It's a very long tale, which result ultimately, as you might have guessed, in the little boy becoming the king of Hungary. So finally, at the end, he goes back to his home. He goes back to see his mother and he draws up, he's the king. He draws up with this incredible retinue and this carriage and all these horses. And the mother is frightened and she doesn't know what this is about. And then he announces himself to her and he says, "Now, dear mother, you shall hear my secret at last. I dreamed that I should become king of Hungary, and my dream has come true. When I was a child and you begged me to tell you, I had to keep silence, or the Magyar king would have killed me. And if you had not beaten me, nothing would have happened that has happened, and I should not now be king of Hungary." So there's so much in that tale, but I think as matters to us today, there's a sense that his mother was beating him, and yet that's what released his fate and allowed it to happen. And this idea that we don't know where something's going to go. We don't know what our psyche's going to do with it. We don't know what meaning will be made of it or how it will relate to our destiny. It kind of takes some of the wind out of the reductive approach that says, because this happened to me, I must be this way.
Or that the thing that happened to me is now the only explanation for all of the suffering that I am having now. And undoubtedly, because we deal with trauma in our practices, there is some truth to that, in as much as the memories of painful things that have happened to us really do trigger our nervous system and we do go into states of pain. But we are far more than that, including holding the capacity to take the energy out of the traumatic memories, liberate ourselves, return those memories to neutral ideas and images that can be stored away in the internal library, and take that freed up energy to create the life that we're destined to have.
It also calls up what the tale and what we are saying about it, the difference between feelings and those kinds of energy states of our sorrow and our pain, like the boy who is crying by the side of the road. He's having terrible feelings and completely understandable. But contrast that with the narrative that the boy created about that was the causative event, as it is in many, many a fairy tale, that set a whole chain of events in motion. It resulted in his becoming the king of Hungary, versus narratives that just lock things up and grind them to a halt. We emphasize, I think, over and over again, the difference between having your feelings and creating a story about them. I can't do anything now because X and Y and Z happened to me when I was a child. And that's fixed, and there's the concrete that has become hardened, versus something more like playing pool, that something happened to me in childhood and this ball hit another ball that hit another ball that hit another ball.
Yes.
And then it went into someplace else.
And inevitable.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But that energy moves. And the difference between thinking of this as the instigating event in a story that is still unfolding versus that's it, there's no more story.
One of the ways that can show up is very subtle and very pernicious, is when something hurtful happens in an interpersonal relationship and we tumble into this feeling that is now the new defining experience for the entire relationship. And people forget that we can also cycle out of that bad feeling or cycle out of that negativity, return to a kind of clear-eyed state, and then once again look at the relationship with a long eye, which includes the positive things that have happened, the neutral things that have happened, but that moment where this crummy thing occurred and now it's forever ruined.
Mm-hmm.
That's a pernicious way of that reductive analysis kind of weaving into our personal philosophy.
I think I'll follow up on that, Joseph, with a story, and I do have permission to share this little vignette. A woman I was seeing was dating someone, and there were some really, really rough dynamics between them. And she came in one day and she said, "I'm dating an abuser. My girlfriend is an abuser." And something about it made me just stop for a second. And I said, well, she's engaging in some behavior that's pretty abusive, but let's not call her an abuser. You sort of announce that someone's an abuser. That's it. Case closed. But both of them were engaged in some dynamics that created a lot of pain. And she was able, to her great credit, she was able to really hang in there with this relationship. They both have, done a fabulous job of kind of growing together in the relationship. And that was many, many years ago. They're still together. They have a fabulous, wonderful, rich relationship. They've worked out a lot of their kinks. But if she had at that moment just really stopped at this place that said, "My girlfriend is an abuser," game over. There's nothing else you can do except leave, I suppose, at that point, right? It closes down options.
The circumstances are always arising, sustaining, and dissolving, just like the Buddha told us. And so are emotional states, so are tensions in our friendships and love relationships. But if you remember that everything is in motion, which is the secret of telos, not only is everything in motion, but there is an intelligence behind the motion, which does not mean there isn't suffering, which is something that sometimes really gets us locked up. But one could say that so long as human beings are motivated by suffering, then the self will require suffering in order to move us along.
And of course, where it wants to move us along to is to our own wholeness, which Jung called individuation, and that was the goal of therapy, was to become who you were really meant to be from the beginning, your biggest, fullest, most complete self. And that there are forces within the psyche that have energy for that. That is the natural gradient, which we mentioned before, of psychic development.
And perhaps that's a good place to switch to a dream.
Did you know your dreams reveal the wisdom of your guiding self? Dreams connect us to the secret world within and remind us that we're never alone. We're always accompanied by our inner companion who offers healing, balance, insight, and guidance as we make key decisions. At 28, Charles felt lost and isolated. He had a dream that touched him deeply. As he worked with the dream in dream school, he understood that it was showing him how he was profoundly connected to life. This powerful insight led him to make real progress with his goals. During Dream School's 12-month transformational program, you'll learn to harness the power of your unconscious wisdom, decode the language of metaphor and symbol, discover mythological motifs that shape your life, reveal unknown facets of your personality, unlock the door to inner wisdom. To enroll, just go to interpretmydream.net and sign up today to gain immediate access to the first 3 Dream School modules. Your best life awaits you at Dream School, and we can't wait to see you there.
Today's dreamer is a 49-year-old woman who works in communications. Here's the dream. She titles this dream, which I think is wonderful. I think that's a nice practice. I try to do that as well. The title of this dream is The Magic Gown. I'm in a dress boutique watching as teenage girls try on bright prom gowns. They giggle, twirl, and take selfies. I need a dress too because I'll be attending the prom as a chaperone. I go into a private changing room that doubles as a small bedroom. The dresses hanging for me to try make me think of Little Bo Peep. Reluctantly, I select the least offensive option, a ribbony mauve number. I'm sure it's going to look ridiculous, but when I step into it, it becomes bespoke black lace, elegant and perfect. I want to send a selfie to my husband. I try to frame my image in the full-length mirror, but a bed is in the way and I can't move it or figure out the angles. Meanwhile, my husband texts sweet portraits of our dog who recently passed away. And the context, she says, in the days preceding this dream, I think I might have had a spiritual awakening. The main feelings in the dream, she says, I feel happy and excited for the girls. My black gown gives me a thrill and a rush of confidence. The mirror situation is frustrating. Tabbing through unexpected photos of our beloved dog feels bittersweet. And finally, she mentions, I enjoy dressing up from time to time, but in general, shopping for clothes is not something I look forward to. Also, my prom memories are not happy ones.
Well, the first general pass that I would make is how a regression can lead to a progression. There's a way in which the dreamer seems like she's being invited back in time, back into this girlishness, which is sometimes called the core or the puella, and that by remembering herself as a vivacious girl who's full of promise, who's full of the prom excitement, that she's able to at first accept her role as the chaperone, that she's going to have to interact with this internal dynamic. She's tasked with taking on the Little Bo Peep gown, that she has to find a stance to move back into this vivacity. And when she surrenders to that, to engaging it, she's gifted with this perfect, elegant dress, which is more than she would have imagined. So what I'm thinking is often in midlife, we do find ourselves going back to the wellspring in the personality, the wellspring of who we were and who we are. And we can often find this river or stream of libido that we suddenly have access to that can move us forward in a new way.
I'm struck by the fact that this dreamer is 49, because for many women, the 50s is an important decade where they do reconnect with their own sense of joy, their own sense of confidence, and even kind of renewed awareness of their own physical attractiveness, paradoxically. And that does seem to be happening. I'm also aware of the Cinderella theme in this dream, which is really lovely and fun. These other girls are going to the ball, and it's not really clear that she's going to get to go to the ball in any meaningful way, because she might be dressed like Little Bo Peep and she has to be the chaperone. But then, just like in Cinderella, the dress is magical. It's perfect. It suits her perfectly. And she just feels this flush of confidence. And it can be a wonderful midlife experience for women in the 50s to realize, like, we can still go to the ball. There's still lots of life there. There's lots of juiciness. And I'm aware that her kind of Cinderella moment, like the fairy tale, leads her to be in contact with an animus figure. And for her, the contact with the animus invites this kind of bittersweet grief, which I think is also appropriate to a midlife stance. There's much to celebrate and look forward to, but there is much also to mourn.
I want to pick up on, this wonderful image of just hearing the dream of the bespoke black lace dress. Whoa, that's hot. That's elegant and really such a great image of coming into one's own as a kind of female power figure. No, it's not a pink dress. It's not pastel. It's pastel. It doesn't have ribbons. It's sexy in a very classic, powerful way. And then the difficulty that she has taking the selfie, because the bed in this dressing room is in the way of the mirror. And it seems to me that this indicates something that is coming online, that she references in her context comments, where she thinks in the days preceding she had a spiritual awakening. But what do we get in a mirror? Well, we get a reflection of ourselves, and there is a very mythic image of what we see objectively from a distance in the mirror versus what we experience in our bodily selves. And that, so coming into full consciousness and being able to see it, live it, feel it objectively isn't quite online yet. And then the call back to the dog who recently passed away, of what's over, what has been loved, that is gone. That was, in a pet, a dog is such a heartfelt connection. It's poignant. Dogs are just loving. And that's something that has gone. We were just talking about the prospective function of the psyche. And clearly, this hot, black, bespoke dress is the direction psyche is pointing to.
I love that she goes into a changing room. Like every analyst needs a changing room somewhere in your office suite where people can go in
and change
it up, and change, and then come out and feel different, look different, try something else on. And changing rooms are also where you try something. That when you pick out a couple of outfits and you go in, it's an experiment. It's not a commitment. It's low cost. You don't have to worry about it. You're alone. There's a mirror. Maybe it looks this way or looks that way. But there's a lot of freedom in just the privacy and the experimentation of the changing room. So hopefully she'll also feel encouraged. Her first attitude to the changing room is this kind of groan that the choices that I have around change are really not appealing, or they seem regressive or silly or embarrassing. But then when she just starts the experiment, just try it on, try this attitude on, try this active imagination stuff on, give it a try. And then all of a sudden, something that we couldn't have expected, that's more appealing than we might have imagined, happens. And that's not unlike a change process.
Yeah.
It's better than we thought.
And it also illustrates that by being willing, to do all of this, if she's willing to be a chaperone and if she's willing to go into the changing room and try on these little Bo Peep type dresses, then something else happens that she, the dream ego, didn't create. That's when that transformative magic can happen, is when we're willing to go into the changing room. It's just perfect.
And I think there's probably just a little something about her photographs of her poor pet that's passed away. And then, as you said, Lisa, there is a grief, there's a melancholy for what has passed. Maybe it's even the passage of youth, because I think many of us think of our pets as being kind of like children, being young aspects of ourselves that are beloved. It's also the passing of the role of being a pet parent. At 49, your child is no longer requiring your care, I'll bet, because of the sad outcome. But I've also had, in my own experience also, losing a pet to old age. At the end of the grief, there is, for a while, a sense of freedom. It's like, oh my gosh, I don't have to come home, let the dog out. I now have a certain amount of freedom to try other things. So it's both deeply sad, deeply sad, but also presents an opportunity to reorganize one's responsibilities.
Another thing about a loss of a pet is that sometimes if we've had a pet for a period of time, the pet dying kind of bookends a life chapter.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, it does.
And it's sort of like, it's like I had that dog for the 10 years that I was in my 40s. And it was when I was, launching my new business, or my kid was blah, 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 and so with the death of the pet, it feels like a death of a part of our life.
That's exactly what I was thinking of, Lisa, that we had a cat and it bookended my kids being in about the 6th grade, all the way through their graduation from college.
Wow.
And it was absolutely symbolic of the end of a life stage.
Yes.
So I think the dreamer might feel confident, might feel encouraged, feel supported, and be curious about these various changes that are brewing in the unconscious.
You've been listening to This Jungian Life. From our website, thisjungianlife.com, you can follow us on Twitter, like us on Facebook, help us produce future episodes by funding us through Patreon, and submit your dreams for possible interpretation on another episode. We'd like to thank our listener who shared a dream for today's show and hope you'll let us know what topics you'd enjoy hearing more about. Until next time, keep living this Jungian life.